Welcome and welcome back, Niki Knacks, to Niki Gets Bored. I'm Niki, your talking head for the show. Today we are going to learn about yellow fever. The first thing you need to know is when I think or hear about yellow fever, this is what happens inside my head. Cabin fever and yellow fever have nothing in common. Well, I suppose you could have cabin fever while you're transporting yellow fever. We'll get to that later. I've added a new playlist to my page. It has videos that dig deeper into topics we discuss on Niki Gets Bored. I don't get paid for sharing these. I don't approve of the channels per se, but I have watched these videos and I found them informative or fun. So if you are like me, you just can't help but to dig a little deeper, you have a place to start. I'll keep adding to it as the show goes on. The ALS update is a link leading to a speech I gave for the Joe Martin ALS Foundation. The Joe Martin ALS Foundation has been the biggest contributor of things that help me in my everyday life. They help with equipment and have caregivers that help me at home to take me on errands. They've also put me in touch with organizations that help with the cost for equipment and medication. The amount of help they've given me is really too numerous for me to tell. And, keep the show around 20 minutes. So please do go watch that video. The link is in the description. If you're looking for a great charity, the Joe Martin ALS Foundation will put your money to tremendous use for those in need. All the links will be in the details section. It's been a long time since I posted a video. The closer to our time that these diseases strike, the more information we have on them. I have to pick and choose the good bits. It's harder to add funny things with such good information. I got a little disheartened. Two Niki Knacks inspired me to get back at it. A big thank you to Joanna N. from the Charlotte area and to Keith G. from the Orlando area. You kind of put the fire under me with your fandom and your love. So thank you for that. Now, let's take a bite out of yellow fever. Skeeters! So we've had illness spread because of air, fleas, water, rats, war, greed, pride, excrement, and miasma, which isn't even real. Yellow fever brings us a new enemy, the mosquito. There are two types of mosquitoes, to be exact, the Aedes and the Haemaggus species of mosquitoes, which I am not pronouncing correct, and I will continue to horribly mispronounce. The Aedes kind live in Africa, where scientists believe yellow fever started. Primates in Africa carry the virus. The Aedes mosquitoes passes it from primates to people. Then mosquitoes also pass it from person to person. Yellow fever spread to the Americas, both south and north, because Europeans just had to stop in Africa on the way to the New World to enslave humans. The Aedes mosquitoes would hitch a ride on ships and sail to the New World. They would snack on cargo, which would be humans, and a ship full of yellow fever would pull into the Americas. The Haemaggus mosquitoes that live in northern South America and southern North America can also carry the virus. So they would also munch a little blood from the ship's passengers. Just like that. Yellow fever arrived and people started dying. These areas became infested with deadly mosquitoes. In areas that got cold, the mosquitoes would die each winter, but each summer they returned. The first wave of cases started in 1668 and they lasted until 1905. And today, these two areas and Africa are where we have the most cases of yellow fever because that's where the Haemophilus mosquitoes live. Let's talk about the disease. Once bit and infected, there's a 3 to 6 day incubation period. But it's unlikely anything happens after incubation because very few who are infected will even have symptoms. Those that do have symptoms experience any number of these: a fever, muscle pain, headache, loss of appetite, nausea, or possibly vomiting. Sounds like the flu. Then those experiencing symptoms get better. How nice. No, false, it gets scary. First, everyone gets better, and then 12% of those realize they only got a fake glimmer of respite, a 2 to 24-hour window of hope. Then they get sick again. They become toxic. Their body systems are attacked, especially the liver and kidneys. People will have dark urine and abdominal pain with vomiting. Bleeding can occur from the mouth, nose, eyes, and stomach. The infected also become jaundice, turning yellow, hence the name yellow fever, because it attacks the liver, turning a person yellowish. Those 12% that have a second round of worse symptoms continue to be sick for 7 to 10 more days. They have a 50% chance of life. However, we can protect ourselves from it. Can you guess how? Go on, guess. There's a vaccine! I love me a good vaccine. If you guessed protect yourself from mosquitoes, you are also correct. And congrats on having great common sense. Now, there is so much more I learned. There's so much info about yellow fever, I had to cut a ton out. It would take way too long to share it all. I picked just three things to share, and then we are going to talk about the interesting things that happened during the worst outbreaks in American cities. Number 1, it was Carlos Finlay who figured out mosquitoes were spreading yellow fever. Just like every other time, he was made fun of. However, he did live to see the science community agree and got the credit for it. The vaccine we use is one of the few live vaccines there are. You don't need it unless you live in or are going to an area at risk for infection. And this is the third fact: the vaccine isn't being made fast enough. Those that really need it can't get fully vaccinated. They get microdoses that don't last, and that requires people to continuously get vaccinated for it. Now I want to talk about yellow fever becoming an epidemic and spreading into the early United States of America. Yellow fever terrorized the East Coast and all the cities we are covering today for years. Summer brought ships with infected mosquitoes. Winter killed the mosquitoes. They came back in warm weather. Lather, rinse, repeat, over and over for years. We are focusing just on the times when things were at their worst for these cities. First up, 1793. Philadelphia was accosted by yellow fever. Just like in the past, all the rich that could left, leaving only the poor to suffer and die. Alexander Hamilton and his wife skedaddled out of town. Unknown to them, they were already infected. They became ill once they arrived, and I can't diss them for this bad decision making. After all, doctors did ask for people to leave if they could, and Hamilton didn't know he was sick yet. The president, George Washington, also skipped town, stating his wife was the reason. She was too worried about him to not have him with her. So our first president left the capital in its time of need. Again, I can't fault him. Smart men, they listen to their wives. 5,000 people died. That's so many. Remember, not many people would develop symptoms, and only 6% that got symptoms actually died. Still, 5,000 died in Pennsylvania. 10% of the population died between April and October that year. Then, the cold temperatures killed off the mosquitoes, and a white flag flew over America's very first hospital, the Pennsylvania Hospital, because finally there were no more yellow fever cases until the following summer. Next up, New York City. Now, when Philadelphia got hit in 1793, New York City put up a quarantine on Governor's Island and didn't let people in, which kept them from getting yellow fever for 2 entire years. Try as they might, they were smacked with it in 1795. It's really hard to quarantine a mosquito, you know? In 1798, it really hit hard. Around 2,000 people died. An interesting fact, people running the city, even those that got sick, didn't report it. They didn't want to lose tourists or locals from the city, causing a loss in revenue. How many times does greed lead to death? In this series alone, we've seen it possibly every show. Also in 1798, yellow fever was smacking down Boston and Philadelphia again. I couldn't find information on yellow fever in Boston. Maybe because at the same time as the yellow fever epidemic, they were also having a scarlet fever epidemic and a slew of other illnesses. There may be just too much information to single out what exactly yellow fever did. Think about this. What if this had happened 20 years earlier while we were fighting for our independence? Nobody has time for a revolution with that much illness. Ain't nobody got time for tea parties and jaundice. We could still be a British colony. Timing is everything. It's 1800, and we're in Baltimore. Good morning, things here get crazy. Early into the epidemic, Boston started lying about having cases of yellow fever. They claimed the increase in deaths were due to the heat and too much drinking of the booze. The people were worried businesses would shut down and they'd go broke. The news still got out because Philadelphia wrote about it and the news traveled, which did end up shutting down all commerce. Which would you rather be, rich and dead or poor and alive? I guess that's your choice. Here's the crazy part. A fight started between the main doctors treating yellow fever in Philadelphia and Boston. The insults flew.
I fart in your general direction. Your mother was a hamster and your father smelt of elderberries.
And escalated until not just the doctors, but both cities' populations were arguing. The government of both cities blamed the other for all sorts of stuff. Mostly, Philadelphia thought Boston was being extremely irresponsible, which they were. It finally de-escalated when the Boston doctor realized he was the one in the wrong.
When I'm wrong, I say I'm wrong.
He switched treatments, and then he sent his notes to Philadelphia for research purposes. 5,000 people in Boston died. I can't help but wonder how many would have lived if people decided it's okay to lose money for the sake of everyone's health, or if the head doctor in Boston had listened to his colleague that had been working longer with the disease. Toxic pride. All right, 5 cities down and 4 to go. The next city that got yellow fever is Norfolk, Virginia. It's right next to the city of Plymouth. They were hit summer after summer, just like the rest. But the summer of 1855 was horrific. And it happened because of Benjamin Franklin. Don't worry, it's not the ambassador, ladies' man, kite flying one. He died like 65 years prior. It was the ship that was named after him. It came to Norfolk with a dead sailor, whose death seemed to have been caused by yellow fever. The captain came ashore and lied, saying it was a heart attack. The Benjamin Franklin ported in Norfolk, and the outbreak that summer killed about 80 people a day. 3,000 died in Norfolk and Plymouth, and many more in surrounding areas as those already infected fled the city. 3,000 dead from a lie and greed, and mosquitoes. 1878, the Mississippi Valley had its worst outbreak of yellow fever. We're talking from southern Mississippi up to Memphis, Tennessee. It started in New Orleans that summer, and then it spread north up the Mississippi River. When it started in a city, residents would flee, trying to escape the epidemic. Cities all around them set up quarantines. Some even had shotgun barricades. It's exactly as it sounds. A bunch of guys with shotguns ready to kill anyone wanting to enter the city. Despite a lot of quarantine efforts, the disease still spread. Again, it's just not easy to quarantine mosquitoes. Cities and businesses emptied. A newspaper in New Orleans wrote, "Only our mosquitoes keep up the hum of industry," which is hilarious. Mosquitoes were spreading it, but people didn't know that yet. Now, Cuba is not in the United States of America, but let's discuss it anyways, because in 1898, the USA was in the Spanish-American War. While fighting in Cuba, more U.S. soldiers, like a lot more, died from disease rather than fighting. Yellow fever was one of the diseases that did a lot of damage. What a good reminder that going to war is only going to lead to bad things. The silver lining is it forced the U.S. to start a yellow fever research team. It was led by Walter Reed, a name that probably sounds familiar. It's the name of the hospital in D.C. named after our biggest yellow fever hero, Walter Reed, who was also a huge hero in the Battle of Scarlet Fever. Let's move back to the U.S., to New Orleans, 1905. New Orleans is a super important port. Even today, it's where the Mississippi River meets the Gulf of Mexico. It connects the entire world to inland USA. In 1853, New Orleans had its worst outbreak. Over 8,000 died. However, New Orleans dealt with the yellow fever from 1817 until 1905. 1905 in New Orleans is the last epidemic of yellow fever in the United States. Because it is warm most of the year, mosquitoes wouldn't die off like they did in the north. They had year-round illness. The city has a nickname, Necropolis. It means City of the Dead. People were dying from way more than yellow fever. It was a scary time. Speaking of spooky, quick sidebar. Do you know why people are buried above ground in New Orleans? New Orleans is below sea level and is built on silt that is sinking. Airtight caskets were buried in wet soil, so when it floods, which is a lot, buoyant caskets pop up out of the ground and they surf the streets. It still happens today, just way less frequently. Talk about scary. No wonder it's called the City of the Dead. Now let's talk about the extra scary racism. One rumor heavily believed was that black people couldn't get yellow fever. Then they used this information to affirm slaves were good for white people, God sent to take care of the white people. The black people were meant to work in hot swamps doing hard labor to save the white people. This rumor of black people having immunity started way back in Philadelphia and was disproved after many black people who stepped up to help caught yellow fever and died. It was even proven wrong in New Orleans, and it was well known. The same people saying black people are immune wouldn't buy a slave unless the slave had proof of once having it and living. Slaves weren't the only ones suffering. Many immigrants from Europe couldn't get jobs because no one was hiring unless you had immunity from yellow fever. New immigrants wouldn't have immunity yet. The mosquitoes that carry it don't even live in Europe. This led to a social structure with immigrants barely above slave status. Many died from yellow fever, but many died due to lack of money for food because they couldn't get hired. During COVID in the USA, discrimination for Asians and Jews increased due to rumors of the cause. Will we ever learn from our historical mistakes? From 1668 to 1905, yellow fever was a constant fear. Today in America, we mostly have immunity to it. We don't get the vaccine unless we travel somewhere the mosquitoes live. If you're traveling to South America or Africa, check with your doctor to see if you need it. You might have immunity already if you live in the South where Haemophilus mosquitoes live. Mosquito population control is what we primarily use to stave off this virus here in the USA. I'm not going to ask what we learned from this. I think we've shown we don't learn much from past mistakes. Instead, I'll do a show to conclude all we've learned at the very end of all the series. That's still a long way away. We have 9 more episodes of diseases. That's the show. Don't forget the ALS update. Follow the links. Niki, it is always great having you. Thank you very much. Make the world better. Remember to cut back on the pride, the greed, and the lies. I will see you next time Niki gets bored.